Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on short film storytelling, which is presented by Ffilm Cymru and BFI Network Wales. My name is Jude Lister, and I'm the BFI Network Wales manager, and I'm joined by Development Executive Gwenfair Hawkins, who unfortunately doesn't have her camera on this morning due to tech difficulties, but who is here. And also, we're very pleased to be joined this morning by Jess Jones, who will be leading the session for us. Also with us is Stefan, who is our interpreter today. If you would like to listen to the Welsh live translation, look for the globe symbol on the black bar at the bottom of your screen. There's an interpretation button and you should select French. This is just because Zoom apparently doesn't have a Welsh option, so we've put it under French. So once you click that button, you should be able to hear the live translation. This session is going to run for around 2 hours. We're going to break it up a little bit. There'll be 2 moments where we open up to questions, one at around the midpoint and another at the end. So if you have any questions that come up at any time during the session, please do submit them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many of them as we can within the time. We are recording this session and we do plan to share it afterwards as well. Now, for those who might not be familiar with BFI Network Wales, we support Welsh-born or based filmmaking talent at the beginning of their careers through training events such as this one, funding for career development, short film production and feature development. I'll talk a little bit at the end about how you can find out more and get in touch with us, but otherwise, I will hand over to Jess. We're very pleased to have Jess with us today. She's a script editor who works across shorts and features. She consults on short film scripts and early development projects for the BFI network across the UK, and is currently working on features for BBC Films, BFI Film Fund and Ffilm Cymru. She's also worked in development for the BFI Film Fund, BBC Drama, Channel 4 Drama, and Bonafide Films, and has script edited on BAFTA and BIFA nominated shorts, and for schemes such as Uncertain Kingdom and the BBC and BFI's Born Digital. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jess, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you for having me. Very, very exciting. Cool. Okay, well, I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. We're going to get going. Let me just see. Fingers crossed there aren't any horrific technical difficulties. Hang on. Okay. There. Hooray, storytelling for short film. That's what we're doing. Awesome. Okay, so to kick off, the question of why tell a story in your film to begin with, because obviously narrative film is not the only kind of film, and there are many examples of beautiful and affecting non-narrative films. So what might make us choose to tell a story in our films? I mean, for me personally, I got into or wanted to be working in film because I love storytelling. And I think humans have an inherent understanding of story, and it's how we create meaning, how we understand the world, how we understand other people. And stories, whether fiction or non-fiction, can provide a portal into other people's experiences, allowing us to feel with them and understand different perspectives. Which, you know, I think feels especially important now. And I love this quote. So from film critic Roger Ebert said, "For me, movies are like an empathy, a machine that generates empathy. If it's a great movie, it lets you understand a little more about what it's like to be a different gender, a different race, a different age, a different economic class, a different nationality, a different profession, different hopes, aspirations, dreams, and fears. It helps us to identify with people who are sharing this journey with us," which I think is really cool. So I think there are lots of good reasons for why you might choose to have a narrative in your film. So where to begin with telling an engaging story for film? So I always like to begin with, why is this story meaningful to you? And often when I'm working with writers, the biggest sort of breakthroughs we can have in terms of sort of the editorial work that we're doing together is really coming back to why this story is meaningful to you and what it is that you want to say. Sometimes I see scripts or treatments that are really well written and really polished, but maybe they're not quite connecting on that sort of emotional level. And I think it's really important to think about sort of what the heart of your film is. And it's not about sort of being slick or impressive or having it be a kind of exercise in good writing. I think it's really important not to make a film just because you want to make a film. It has to be because you have something you want to say, and something that you want to communicate to an audience. So as I say, it's sort of not about trying to be really impressive, or to show off your knowledge of cinema, or to make something that's cool. It has to be what you want to say as a filmmaker and as a human being. So I think it's always about going back to what really excites you about this story, or about this world, or about this character, or this relationship, and the journey that your protagonist or protagonists go on, and thinking about it sort of like if you were at a party or something and you were telling your friends about this story that you want to tell. What's the thing that you'd really hone in on and be like, oh, this is amazing, or this is so sad, or what's that thing that really sort of gets you fired up? Because it's that really that that sort of really drilling down into what's important and meaningful to you that will connect to the audience. So I think it's really, really important to remember that and really connect to that. So remember your audience. This is really important. Don't forget that you're not going to make a film in a vacuum. So always keep in mind that you are trying to communicate something to someone. You're not just making it for yourself. So whilst it is really important to go back to what's meaningful to you, you have to remember that also your film it can't just be for you or even for your friends, unless you're making something just for fun that you're going to screen in your back garden or something. So really spend some time thinking about how you can speak to, move, engage, connect with a wider audience. Always remember that you're speaking to someone. So what do you want your audience to understand is a really important question to ask yourself. What do you want their takeaway to be? I think that sometimes that question gets left behind, but actually it's really, really, really important. And one of the things we often talk about, that sort of being as specific as possible helps create a story that feels universal. And that specificity in character, specificity in world, it allows an audience to really go into your story and be in this world, and be with this character. And the more that they're able to do that, the more that they're able to feel with them and understand them. And this allows us to connect our own experience to what we're watching, even if that experience seems to be far away from our own lived experience. So being really specific about your story is really important too. One thing I think is important to talk about is that I see a lot of new filmmakers who want to make something that's quite ambiguous. And whilst it's not that you can't make something that's ambiguous and be successful at it, for me anyway, when I think of stories that have really moved me, or if we look at stories that have really stood the test of time and have spoken to, lots of people in a broader way, it's generally clear what those stories are about. It's generally clear what we should care about and why we're investing in this film. Have you ever sat through a short film or a feature film and sort of gotten to the end and thought, well, it looked really good, or it was really impressive, or this actor was good, but I don't really know what the point was. What was it actually about? And I think we do need to know as an audience what to care about. And that's not to say it's not about spoon feeding your audience, but I think it's about really thinking, how to take your audience by the hand and kind of guide them through their experience of your film. And I think without that, and if you leave something too open-ended or sort of too ambiguous, it can leave an audience kind of thinking, what was the point in what I just watched? So have a think about what your audience's experience is going to be of your film. Also, always important to have a think about your film in the wider context of what's going on in society now, and how it will be received by your intended audience. And all of this isn't to say that there isn't room for things that are more unconventional or experimental, but it's just that, again, you want to be thinking about what your audience's journey will be as they watch your film. What should they think and feel as they're watching it? What should they understand by the end? Or even what will have changed for them? So yes, remember your audience. It's a big one. So another question to ask yourself is, what makes this story distinctive? And sort of within that, I want to talk about this kind of elusive concept of what voice is, because I think that's the thing that we're always we're looking for, that commissioners and execs and producers are sort of looking for, that kind of idea of voice. And I think I heard someone describe it recently as truth from your unique perspective as a filmmaker. So sort of thinking about that idea of them, there may not be new stories, but there are new storytellers. And for me anyway, I want to know how you see the world. I want to know what you think. I want to understand the world through your eyes and your perspective. And I think that is really what voice is about ultimately. Sometimes I also describe it as having something interesting to say and having an interesting way of saying it, which doesn't mean sort of breaking all the rules of storytelling or of form and doing something kind of mad just for the sake of doing it. Sort of going back to this idea again of really looking inward and connecting with what is truth and meaning for you personally as a filmmaker. So don't try to anticipate what an exec or a funder wants to see, because this will just dilute your vision as a filmmaker, and what you could end up sort of pitching or writing something that doesn't have you in it, and that's what everyone's really looking for. We want to see you, and know what you want to say. Also, don't try to recreate something that you've seen before. Audiences are not looking for what they've seen before. What we're all looking for is that story that only you can tell. So yeah, I mean, so much of this, for me anyway, is going back to always, what do you want to say? But then another important component of this is asking the question of, why does this story need to be told now? So we often talk about urgency, which is sort of contrary to, I think, what I hear from a lot of new filmmakers. It doesn't mean that you have to create something that is sort of issues driven. What it means is really looking at what light does this story shed on the way that we live now. What does this say about the human experience now, and how will this resonate with audiences now? So you can tell a story that's set a long time ago, but be thinking about what are the themes and experiences, and what are the stories that speak to who we are, or who we're evolving to be as a society. So that component is really important to consider. But as I say, I don't think of that as a kind of a barrier. Think of that as something that's kind of exciting to engage with. What is it about the world now that you want to explore or examine? And then, yes, be ready to interrogate your own ideas. Another thing I often see with newer filmmakers is, and understandably, because it can be a very vulnerable process, creating and telling stories, but there is a fear or lack of desire, perhaps, in sort of wanting to get feedback and wanting to kind of think about what this story that you're wanting to tell, and really interrogating in a deep way what it's about. Be prepared to have other people question your ideas, and be excited about that if you can be. If you can find a way to be excited about that, it will help you, and you can make use of that to really go deeper with what you want to say. Cool. And collaborate. Very important. The process of filmmaking is collaborative at all different levels. And particularly if you're receiving funding from somewhere, the more voices there are in the pot, the more the more notes and the more feedback you're going to get. And it's sort of, unless you're making a film just, it's self-funded and it's on a small budget, you're not going to be given sort of total autonomous creative freedom to just make anything that you want. Obviously, people will be wanting to support you and your voice as a filmmaker, but it's really important to be aware that it is collaborative. Because I think that's something that can feel quite difficult initially. Okay, so I'm banging on about this as an idea because it's important with this idea of what is your film about. And it sort of seems like a really obvious thing to say, but or an obvious question to ask. But I often work with filmmakers where this isn't clearly defined, or where they're trying to make their film about too many different things at once. And I always say that if you're trying to say too many things, you just kind of end up not really saying anything. So it's about really defining what your film is about, having a really clear sense of what you want to say with your story, and having that in mind while you're developing it. So think of it as your North Star that keeps you heading along the right path as you're constructing this story, and make sure you don't have too many competing strands, making sure every narrative element is coming together to tell the same story, to tell the same thing. You don't want things kind of pulling us off in different directions, because that will just dilute what you're trying to say. I just have some water. So one of the things that will help you with this in defining what your film is about is defining your premise in one sentence. And this isn't necessarily the same as your logline, although you might find that doing this work on your premise will help with your logline too. But this sentence doesn't necessarily have to be seen by anyone except you. It's just to help you stay on track as you're developing this story. So premise is who the story is about, plus what their conflict or problem is, and how this conflict or problem is resolved. So that resolution of the conflict or problem is the kind of key bit in some ways, and often filmmakers will have the first two bits of, well, who they are, what the world is, and kind of what their conflict or problem is. But the resolution part is especially important because this is where we'll find the ultimate meaning. So, for example, I have some really terrible examples to use today, so I apologize. But so if we took the example of, so who the story is about, we have a young man who wants to get married, conflict, but can't seem to maintain a romantic relationship. And resolution is he decides to focus on other things that make him happy instead. So if you bear that resolution in mind as I go on to the next example, so this resolution is, so he decides to focus on the other things that make him happy instead. And conversely, a young man who wants to get married but can't seem to maintain a romantic relationship, so he asks his best friend to marry him. So those are obviously two very different films, even though they've got the same character at the heart of it, with the same conflict. It's the resolution that actually changes the meaning. So with the first example, where the resolution is, so he decides to focus on other things that make him happy instead, the meaning that we might derive from that is, for example, in order to be truly happy, we have to look internally rather than externally. So that could be one meaning of your that you would choose to explore in your film. And the second one, where he asks his best friend to marry him, the meaning might be, sometimes our dreams don't end up looking like we thought they would. So those are two very different, this may seem sort of obvious, but those are two very, very different films, and what our takeaway as an audience will be are very different. So premise again, so who the story is about, what their conflict or problem is, and how this conflict or problem is resolved. And the resolution of the conflict or problem will speak to your central thematic argument, or the ultimate meaning of your film. And we will come on to talk about central thematic argument, just checking the time. Yeah, we've got time to do it in this section. So your central thematic argument is another tool that will help you refine what it is that you want to say. Another term for central thematic argument is the controlling idea. So that might be something that you've heard instead. And this central thematic argument or controlling idea links into your premise. So theme and your central thematic argument are different. So try not to just focus on theme in your story, because this can make it feel too general. What you need is to have your own angle or argument on that theme. And again, it's about being really specific about this. So if, for example, we took the theme of love, which is very broad, obviously there are multiple films about love. So you could have two films that are that have the theme of love, but be very different because of the angle that you've taken on love, or what your central thematic argument is. So if we took one central thematic argument on love, it could be love will only break your heart versus love will always win over hate. So that both those films have the theme of love, but they have different central thematic arguments. And love is explored in very different ways and will therefore result in two very different films. So when you're thinking about your story, and obviously love is particularly broad as a theme, but if you sort of have an idea in mind of what your theme is, or what themes in general you might be wanting to explore, go that one step further and have a think about, well, what is it that you want to say about this theme or this idea? It can't just sort of be like, here's a story about love, because that, I mean, apart from anything else, it will make it so difficult for you to write or to create or bring about, because it won't give you clear enough parameters for how you're going to go about constructing that story. So character journey, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but your character journey in terms of your central thematic argument, they're very interlinked. So plot and character are very, very closely related. And I think it's helpful to think about your character journey as being, at the beginning, they embody the opposite of your central thematic argument. And through the process of the story, you as the filmmaker are teaching them your central thematic argument, so that by the end, they now embody the argument. So you as the filmmaker want to be creating scenarios where they have to start to learn this argument. And your character's always wanting to sort of maintain the status quo, and they always want to go back to where they were at the beginning. But you, as the sort of godlike filmmaker, will be creating all of these obstacles and scenarios where they have to move forward. So if we took the previous example of, in order to be truly happy, sorry, not Q&A yet. In order to be truly happy, you have to look internally. At the beginning of the story, we'd see this young man as sort of desperate to find the right relationship and to get married. And that might look like him going on multiple dates, or I don't know, being sad when they go wrong. But as he moves through the story, he realizes that actually he needs to stop looking externally in order to find happiness. So ultimately makes a choice to go on a yoga retreat, or something that's about his self-development instead. So by the end, he has grown to embody this argument of, in order to be truly happy, you have to look internally. Okay, I think we could be ready to go to questions now, because I feel like there might be lots of questions.
Brilliant. Yes, we do have some questions.
Cool.
So the first one was, do you think the idea of voice, just going back to what you were kind of talking about around voice, is this as important for a producer as it is for a director or a writer?
In terms of the producer, perhaps the producer's slate, do we think that means?
Yes.
That's a very interesting question. I think, I'm trying to think of the producers that I know. I think that is important, in that I think there are certain films or stories, yes, that embody that what the producer wants to say and the stories that they're excited about. So yes, I would say that that's really important for producers too. And yeah, to have a think about what resonates with them, what moves them, what are the stories that they want to bring forth into the world. Yeah, I think very important for producers too.
Great, thank you. And if we're talking, for example, about a 5-minute short, one of the questions was resolving narrative and thematic journeys within 5 minutes would be very packed. How can you avoid diluting one or the other for the sake of the time?
That's a really good question. Yeah, with shorts, there isn't a lot of time to unpack that. So I think it might be that you don't have as much time to build up to, and I'm going to go into this sort of in the next section, that you don't have as much time to explore a conflict as you would in a longer film. And it might just be about thinking, what's your defining moment of change within that 5 minutes? What's the moment? And again, I'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of what the climax of the film is. What's that moment where your character realizes something fundamental, or makes a decision that sort of changes the course of their life in some way. And I think it's helpful to build your story around that, because there still has to be change even within a 5-minute short, but it might just be that you've got to very quickly establish right from the outset what your sort of central conflict is, and then think about where that big moment of change is, and think really carefully about constructing as concisely as possible the journey from one to the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. We have another question. So in a story, can you have a character embody one central thematic argument, for example, that love will always break your heart, but then throughout the story, this character decides to change the central thematic argument that love will always win, for example?
Absolutely. But it sounds like ultimately your central thematic argument as the filmmaker is that love will always win. So what we would walk away from, what we'd take away as the audience would be that second meaning. But what you'd have is your character at the beginning believes something else or embodies something else, and it's the journey that you take them on to move to that second argument that really is the crux of what their journey is through the story. So yeah, it kind of sounds like to me that still ultimately is one central thematic argument.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question is, do all subplots or journeys of important secondary characters always have to feed back into the central thematic argument in a short?
So yes, ultimately, and in a feature length film you obviously have a lot more time to explore your central thematic in different ways, and also in a feature you might choose to make it an ensemble piece instead, and you might have various different strands and various different ways of exploring your thematic territory or your thematic argument, and even within an ensemble piece you might be able to have it so that you have different characters exploring slightly different central thematic arguments. But within a short, you really have to kind of narrow your focus, because you don't have the time to do justice to sort of myriad strands. So I would also say within a short, you would want to be very careful in terms of subplots or secondary characters, that they're not pulling away from your protagonist. And I would generally say that you can really only explore one protagonist, or maybe a relationship, and have a dual protagonist in a fictional film anyway. With documentary you might choose to explore a community or sort of multiple perspectives, but yes, but ultimately, whether it's a feature or a short, you want all of your narrative strands to be coming together to say the same thing. Yeah, unless it's an ensemble where it's more like that's the prism through which you're kind of projecting your theme, and then you're sort of seeing all kind of different facets of that theme. But yes, ideally they would all be coming together to at least support your central thematic argument rather than detract from it, unless caveating everything now, unless there's a certain facet of your argument that you want to explore the other side of in order to ultimately perhaps still come back to this is what you want to say. Yes, it was a long answer.
I'm just going to flag that if you want to ask a question, please do input it in the Q&A box at the bottom rather than the chat, just to flag that for everybody. Have we got time for another question?
Yes. I think we're slightly ahead of time, actually. So
great, let's forge ahead. So what would you say would be the ideal length or lengths of the best shorts that you've seen?
It's a very good question. I mean, I guess for sort of BFI network purposes and Film Cymru purposes, it would be under 15 minutes anyway, wouldn't it?
Yes, depending on the kind of fund, but yes.
Yeah. So I would say that as a general rule. I guess around the 12-minute mark you'd want to aim for. I think, yeah, you don't want to go over 15 minutes, because I think once you start to go over, I think you could always pare it back, and the more kind of concisely you can tell a story, the better. But I don't know that there's a kind of magic number. What do you think, Jude? Do you think there's a magic number?
I don't think there is. I think obviously it will depend on the story that you want to tell. And I've seen brilliant 3-minute shorts, and I've seen brilliant half-an-hour shorts, which is usually around the point where you get a cut-off for festivals, which is definitely something you want to consider as well. Like, what kind of places do you want your film to get seen, and do they have their own definitions of kind of what a short film is? I think, you know, if there were to be any kind of standard, it's probably around that 30-minute mark. But as you say, shorts a lot of the time, and especially through BFI Network, we tend to fund up to that 15 minutes mark, and that tends to be a really good length for a short. But yeah, ultimately it will depend on your story, I think.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So we have a question from a writer here who says, when I get an idea for a film, I have the tent poles that hold up the story, but struggle to come up with scenes leading up to this moment. Have you ever come across writers who have this problem? And do you have any suggestions of how to help?
So yes, firstly, all writers, I think, generally, because I think that is a hard thing to do. And I think when you're kind of sitting down and having to sort of create that plot, it is hard. Especially when it comes to a feature. I think, so if we're talking about it in terms of a short, it's potentially slightly easier, and I am going to go more into kind of structure in the second half. But yes, how you sort of get them from tentpole to tentpole, and the kind of transition scenes. What's a good way to think about that? I think it's thinking about where your character is on that journey, in terms of that shift from embodying the opposite of your argument to embodying the argument. Where are they? And you can push and pull them around. So they might take some steps forward towards that argument and then take some steps back. You're sort of always wanting to create ultimately a kind of curve that goes up like that. So you don't want to zigzag around too much, but you know, they're always wanting to go back to the status quo. And you know, we sort of, as humans, you know, we don't necessarily like change, and so we're wanting to hold on to sort of our identities and our sense of self and our world and our worldview as much as we possibly can. So I think those scenes are about creating scenarios or the environment where that has to be challenged for your character. I don't know if that helps, because I feel like it's one of those things that it sort of depends what the story is. But yeah, I think it takes time to do that, and to not be worried if it's taking you a long time, because that's sort of part of the process, and it's something that I think all writers find hard to do. But for me, I think it is always coming back to, as I keep banging on about, what's the film about, what do you want to say, and what that journey is. And that will hopefully be able to give you that structure to work within.
Great, thank you. I think a little bit along similar lines, there's a question that is, can the premise evolve along with the project, or is it a must to have it defined from the outset?
It can definitely evolve. Absolutely. I think it can be really helpful to define your premise at the beginning, even just for your own sanity, that you have something clear that you're working towards initially, even just to try it out. But yes, absolutely, the development process is a kind of organic, ever-changing process. So if you have a go at writing a treatment, or or some other development document, or you have a really good conversation with whoever's helping you develop it, and your producer or exec or script editor, and then suddenly you find that there's actually another facet of this that's really, really fascinating, and actually you hadn't quite nailed down exactly what it was that you wanted to say, and it's this thing instead. I think that that's absolutely fine. I mean, you want to be careful that you want to balance that with not changing it kind of all the time every day, because you'll never move forward. And I think that sometimes that desire to keep changing it comes out of sort of fear that your idea isn't good enough, or the kind of self-doubt starts to creep in. So I think it's important to pay attention to whether this is genuinely, kind of from an editorial, from a creative standpoint, actually this isn't quite the film that you want, the film you want to make, or the story that you want to tell, and it's something else. But if it's coming up a lot, and when you sit down to start writing, and it kind of pops up, and it's like, oh, I don't think it's this idea, it's that idea is not very good, then it might be about it might be sort of a sort of psychological element of it, rather than an editorial element. But yes, certainly it can evolve.
Thank you. Have we got a bit more time to answer some questions? Got quite a lot of questions.
Yes, we've got time.
Okay, so we have one which is, if you're struggling to articulate your central thematic argument, what questions would you ask yourself to help find it?
That's a really good question. I would try out a few different things. I mean, certainly I find it helpful to do this in a conversation, and so when I'm working with writers, that will be the, we might spend a few hours talking about that right at the beginning of our time working together, and may come back to it multiple times to check that that's still the direction that we're going in. So I would say it's trying different arguments out, even whether that's in conversation with someone who's, as I say, helping you develop it, or it's, you know, writing loads down. I think it's choosing one that resonates with you. And again, it's sort of going back to this big question of what do you want to say and what are you interested in about this theme. And sort of linking to the previous question, you may not know absolutely right at the beginning, and it might be that you pick one to sort of try on for a few days and let that change and evolve. But it's, yeah, I think it's digging into what's meaningful to you. Why do you care about this? Again, sort of thinking about the filmmaking process as a conversation with an audience. And if you were having a conversation with someone about this, what would be the points that you would pick up on, and what might you actually argue or not argue, or be interested to sort of explore further? So I don't know, that sort of maybe feels a bit woolly and abstract, but sometimes it's helpful just to have a chat with someone. And yeah, just or write down different possible arguments, I think. Yeah, I hope that's helpful and not too woolly. That person can come and find me if it is.
We have another question, which is, how can I differentiate events from plot?
How can I differentiate events from plot? I'm not sure I totally understand. I wish I could speak to the person to clarify. What's your understanding of that, Jude?
I think perhaps events in terms of the journey that the film is taking the audience on versus just the plot of what's happening. I mean, those can be the same thing, I would suppose.
Yeah, I guess that's why I'm questioning it, because I think they can be the same thing exactly. I suppose what you'd want to be careful with the events is that they are creating change and they are moving your plot forwards, so they're not just kind of standalone events, because that you're sort of attached to the idea of a particular sort of set piece, that you're thinking, right, at the beginning of this event, where is my character, where is, you know, what's the status of my world, and at the end of this event, what has moved forward, what has changed, because that's what will help evolve your plot and move your plot forward. So I don't know if that helps, but they can be one and the same.
Okay, we've got a specific question about documentaries here, which is, how do you identify the climax of the film and the resolution before you start shooting?
So I have to say that documentaries are not my area of expertise. So I may not be able to speak to that with the same clarity that someone else might be able to. My understanding is that you may not always know what your climax is before you begin shooting, but that you might construct that once you have all of your footage, and that you start to find the story, or you find the story while you're shooting. Jude, is that something that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll obviously depend when your story is taking place. So, it's a lot more obvious if you're basing a documentary on historical events, for example, or a story that's already played out, than, if you're kind of shooting something that is happening in the present day.
Yeah.
So there's obviously, you'll have very different approaches depending on also what kind of documentary I think you're making.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough question, that one, I think.
Yeah, it is. That is hard. Maybe someone else can jump in with the answer.
Yes, please put thoughts in the chat box.
Just looking at the time, I'm wondering if it's helpful for me to jump back in, because it feels like there are lots of questions coming in.
There are, yes, but we will have some time at the end as well to go through as many questions as we can.
So yeah, so maybe it's helpful if I jump back in and make sure I'm just leaving enough time for everyone to ask questions at the end.
Sure.
Okay, awesome. Cool. Okay, I'll go on to part two then. And maybe some of these will answer some of the questions or bring about some new questions as well. Okay. So yes, making sure there's enough change in your story. So stories are inherently about change. So the degree of change might be small, but there must be change. There has to be change in your story. And I should say that I'm sort of going into, it did with the previously, and going into sort of your premise and central thematic argument, that I'm sort of going into very kind of screenwriting tools space now, but not to get too bogged down in them, and don't sort of think about these things as sort of rules necessarily, but as tools that you can use to help you refine and define your story. And also that I'm going to be referring to your protagonist or your character, because the majority of short films will likely be single protagonists. And again, sort of going back to what I said earlier, of that ideally, certainly for fictional short films, I would generally recommend you have a single protagonist, because you don't have time to explore more than one POV, and the exception to that might be that you choose to explore a relationship instead, and explore two characters rather than one character. And in a documentary, as I said, you might choose to explore a community or a group of people, but the things I'm referring to are still relevant either way. I'll just be referring to your character or your protagonist in the singular, but extrapolate from that for multiple characters if that's what your story is. So questions to ask about your protagonist journey in order to make sure that there is enough change. How have they changed by the end of the story? So really thinking about, who are they at the beginning and who are they at the end? And sometimes a more helpful way of thinking about that is, what is their significant state of being at the beginning versus at the end? Because sometimes that question of who are they at the beginning and who are they at the end feels so kind of broad and existential. But what is their significant state of being that you're exploring at the beginning, and how has this evolved by the end? But another thing to think about is, what have they learnt by the end, or what have they gained by the end? So again, this is super important, and really is going to help you define what that journey is. How have they changed by the end? Make sure that you have got proper change in there. And for sort of more experimental or more kind of unconventional narratives, perhaps it's thinking more about sort of carefully crafting what the audience's journey is. So what we should feel when, what we should think or understand when, and what we should understand overall, and what have we gained or realized by the end. How have we changed in our understanding? So yeah, making sure there's enough change. So creating drama is a sort of important thing for telling an engaging story, or creating comedy if it's a comedy. But in order for there to be drama, you need to give your protagonist a problem or conflict, as I was sort of referring to earlier. So you can think about this in terms of obstacles. So what does your character want, and what is stopping them from getting it? And that can be internal or external. So it could be that it's a part of who they are that is ultimately stopping them from being able to move forward and get the thing that they want. So for example, I have here a character who wants to right their wrongs, but they hate apologizing. So that could be for a comedic effect for a comedy. A character who wants to find acceptance, but they're too scared to show their true self to the people around them. Now that could be a combination of internal and external. Or a character who wants to be a dancer, but their father would disown them. Slightly stolen that from Billy Elliot. But that's a sort of example of more of an external conflict. So whatever this conflict is that you choose to have and to explore, it must be invested with tension. So by that, I mean, it's got to be something that the audience, we either want to see them succeed or fail. And again, this is true of comedy too. So in order for us to invest in that way, we have to know what the stakes are. So the stakes are what the character stands to lose or gain if they succeed or fail. So we need to know from the outset what succeeding or failing means to this character from early on, and we need to be reminded of it as we move through the story. So if it's winning a big sporting event or something, that then we need to know why that matters to them. What does that mean to them in terms of their identity, their standing in the world? Does it mean that they think that they'll win love, or what is it that they stand to lose or gain, whether they succeed or fail? And this conflict needs to be set up in a short film, needs to be set up in the first scene or in the first couple of scenes, and we need to know from the outset what the conflict is, and what the stakes are, in order for us to invest in what's going on. Obviously, you'd have a lot longer to explore that in a feature, but you have such limited time in a short that you really want to set out your stall from the very first scene, ideally. So in terms of those first couple of scenes, having a think about how you can most succinctly and concisely speak to that conflict. What's the kind of best example that you might be able to give us of your character experiencing this conflict? So again, going back to the importance of resolution, this conflict needs to be resolved by the end of the film. So that again is going to help you create change. So when I say it needs to be resolved, that doesn't mean it needs to be fixed, or it can be resolved either positively or negatively. It doesn't mean that there has to be a happy ending. It's just that those strands need to be tied up in a way that feels clear and satisfying. As another caveat to that, there are certainly times where not resolving something entirely is okay, because that lack of resolution in itself speaks to what you're exploring. So if your central thematic argument is something like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something on the spot, but that things are never black and white, and we never know the right path to take. That, even though that's exploring shades of grey, you would still want to resolve or end your film in a way that speaks to that, if that is clear. So it's not that there has to be this kind of neatly tied up, ending with a bow, but if you're not doing that, there has to be a reason why you're not doing that, and it has to speak to this, whatever that wider idea is that you're exploring within the film. So yes, so however you choose to resolve this conflict or problem will speak to your central thematic argument and whatever your film is ultimately about. But again, it can be sort of resolved negatively, where your protagonist doesn't get what they want, or they do fail, or they turn into a, I don't know, evil baddie. I love the word baddie. So yeah, it doesn't have to be a positive resolution necessarily. So I think this might speak a little bit to one of the questions earlier. So talking about escalating conflict, I have some terribly drawn arcs at the bottom of the page there, which I will describe. So as I said, you want to set up your protagonist's conflict in the first scene or couple of scenes, and from then onwards you want to escalate or build this conflict until you reach the climax, and you want to build steadily towards your climactic moment. And this means putting increasing pressure on the conflict as you move through the story. So, for example, if we go back to the kind of previous example that we were talking about, and we look at our character who had the conflict of they want to get married, but they can't seem to make a romantic relationship work, we would want to see them in various situations where this conflict is put under pressure, where we see their need or their desire to want to make this relationship work and find someone that they can marry, but that whatever it is that they're doing means that they're sort of stopping themselves from achieving that. So I guess in that example, it would be different dating scenarios. And with the increasing pressure, you sort of want to see them, you want to see them sort of getting worse and worse. And so it is about thinking about creating or highlighting the perfect scenarios to put your particular character and their particular problem under the most pressure or the most tension. So in really, really basic terms, if, for example, you had a character whose problem was that they're afraid of spiders, you wouldn't put them in situations where they're on increasingly tall buildings. You would put them in situations where there were more and more and bigger spiders. So just to talk about at the bottom here, these sort of arcs. So I quite often see short scripts in particular, where there's a lot of setup and we sort of just see scenes that almost kind of describe the character and the world and how they feel about things. And then you will get a sort of sudden, sharp uptick towards the end where the climax happens and where they suddenly change. But actually, we haven't seen any of the beats or moments that have built smoothly towards that climax. So you don't want the climax to sort of come out of nowhere. You want to make sure that you're, as I say, sort of putting increasing pressure on and exploring further and further this climax, this problem or conflict, in order to get to the climax. And similarly, that sort of one in the middle, where you see this is more about the degree of change perhaps not being quite enough, that you kind of have a lot of setup, a lot of establishing the world, and then something kind of changes and then it's the end. Or you see sort of lots of snapshots of something, you know, again, sort of that might be more about the kind of character's state of mind, and that doesn't necessarily have that kind of propulsion and that build and that escalation towards a moment of big change. So this one at the end is a little bit of setup, and then something sort of happens here that I would normally talk about, the inciting incident here, which I sort of haven't gone into in detail today, but this is, if you sort of think about your inciting incident as the moment that propels your character out of their ordinary world, and you establish their ordinary world in the setup. Within their ordinary world, you're looking at what their conflict is. So that's part of their ordinary world, and their inciting incident would be the thing that that propels them out of that ordinary world. And then you want to be able to build and build and build steadily up until this sequence of climactic action sometimes, or it could just be a moment of a climax, and then you have falling action afterwards, where we see maybe a little bit of the result of whatever has happened in the climax. But again, in a short, you would have less of that falling action, probably, or you might sort of have a scene or a beat where we understand that now the change that has taken place in the climax, it has an effect in how this character is going to live the rest of their life, or how they're going to go, how they're going to be in the world. So that's escalating conflict. This is a little bit more on the climax. So your climactic moment, or the climactic action, is where your protagonist either undergoes their greatest moment of change, or makes a significant choice that changes them or the course of their life in some way, or where they reach their highest point of knowledge. For example, they learn or realize something fundamental to who they are. And actually, as a side note to this, it's really important that your protagonist is active. This is, again, something that I see a lot, where a protagonist might be sort of a kind of like things are happening to them all the time, but they're not necessarily being proactive in their journey through the film. So you want to be really careful that they're not a sort of passive passenger while external things just happen to them. They have to take action that affects the story. So this is particularly true of the climax, that even where their conflict might have been driven by external factors, this moment of climactic action has to be centered around the protagonist and change it within them. So this moment of change, or them making a significant choice, or learning or realizing something. And you might have them learn or realize something fundamental, and then they make a significant choice, or they undergo this huge moment of change, and that's what gives them the particular insight or allows them to access this knowledge that they previously didn't have. So if we took our central thematic argument again of, in order to find true happiness, you have to look internally, our climax would need to be centered around our character finally realizing this, and or making the decision to change how they've been going about things. So, for example, we might see them turn down going on yet another date with someone who probably isn't going to make them happy, and instead booking a yoga retreat or a pottery class or something like that, something to do with their own self-development. But the other thing that you need to consider is that whilst you're building to this climax and putting pressure on their conflict, you also need to be simultaneously building up the narrative strand which facilitates them having this realization or making this decision in the climax. So again, sort of using that previous example. So does this character have a friend who always seems really content and happy, and they have no interest in dating, so this makes our protagonist question themselves. So it's sort of constructing something that also presents the sort of your sort of central thematic argument, which allows them to have this this moment of change within the climax. There's a really good podcast called Script Notes, and they have a really good episode called How to Write a Movie, and they break down brilliantly and concisely this connection between character and plot, using Finding Nemo. Amazing. And the sort of person or the character that embodies, so they talk about how the central thematic argument of Finding Nemo is, if you love someone enough, you have to learn to let them go. And basically Marlon goes on this journey where at the beginning he embodies the opposite of that, and that he thinks if in order to love Nemo, he has to stop Nemo from, you know, ever experiencing anything or kind of being put in any danger or anything like that. But as he moves through the story, his worldview is opened up, and he realizes that that you know he can't control everything, and that he has to learn to see Nemo for who he is, and let Nemo do, you know, be Nemo. But so he kind of undergoes all of these experiences that allow him to see that. But also Dory is really important as a character who sort of embodies the argument, and is someone who is kind of, you know, doesn't take that level of control. So yeah, so having something else that sort of speaks to this strand that will help facilitate the change is important. Okay, so final note on dialogue. So this will, I apologize, this is sort of only relevant really to fiction filmmakers, so I apologize for that, but dialogue is a thing that comes up a lot with newer filmmakers. So some quick bits and pieces on dialogue. So one thing I would say and really highly recommend is to make sure you read your dialogue out loud, which again sort of seems like an obvious thing, but I think all too often people don't do this. So whether it's just out loud to yourself, or you get some friends to help you, make sure that you hear the dialogue out loud, and make sure that it feels naturalistic, and it feels like something that real human beings would say. And remember that film is a visual medium, so you need to tell stories visually, and you need to use dialogue really sparingly. I always tell writers to use dialogue as a last resort. So if you can't find another way to communicate what you need to, then you can use dialogue. But ideally, you'd be looking for ways to communicate how someone's feeling, with, you know, or what the status of a relationship is, etc., through behavior. So I think it's Robert McKee has these figures which speak to how much dialogue versus visual storytelling you should have across different mediums, which I always think is really interesting. And I think particularly because I've sort of worked with lots of writers who have come from a playwriting background and moving into writing for screen, this can be the dialogue, the sort of jump in terms of how you use dialogue can feel really big. So with playwriting, so for the theatre, you'd be looking at 80% dialogue and 20% visual storytelling. TV is about 50-50, but film is around 20% dialogue and 80% visual storytelling. So really, really pulling back on dialogue as much as you possibly can. So, and remembering that as human beings, we quite often, or we sort of rarely say exactly what we think or mean. Sometimes because we don't know ourselves, you know, we haven't been able to define that for ourselves, and we can't articulate it clearly, or because we want to say something but we're afraid of hurting someone's feelings, or you know, any sort of number of things that mean we basically we rarely sort of articulate exactly what it is that we mean, particularly in an emotional situation. So instead, it's how it comes out in the character's behavior. So you have to create the emotional circumstances in order for us to understand what is going on with your character through their behavior. And it's important to keep the idea of subtext in mind. So yeah, connecting back to this point of that we rarely say exactly what it is that we think or mean, that part of your job as a writer will be communicating subtext to us, and it can be helpful to think about subtext as being dialogue plus behavior, so they both bring a sort of a different part of subtext, and that often behavior is in opposition to what is being said, so that gap is where we can infer subtext. So that was a really, really whistle-stop tour of dialogue, behavior and subtext, but I feel like we've got lots of questions coming in, and I want to make sure we've got time for all of the questions. So Jude, if we go back to Q&A now, does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
So is it okay if I jump in very quickly?
Please do.
Great. I just want to highlight that I think what Jess pointed out about dialogue is really important, because I think we have a few people on the call, and I know in terms of BFI Network Wales, we often do get people crossing over from theatre into film. And sometimes if we have to turn down projects, our feedback is often that it's not cinematic enough. So I think really thinking about how that different medium works for your story is crucial. And I think dialogue is the kind of it's a kind of useful door in terms of thinking about that.
Definitely.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So, further questions. Somebody asking if you could talk about the notion of a tragedy in which a character doesn't get what they need at the end of the story, but reverts to their destructive wants. So not changing for the better, and perhaps not getting the resolution that they needed.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that is important to bear in mind. But that would again go back to ultimately what are you saying? So I'm sort of desperately grasping around for a really good example, but failing miserably. But yes, so your central thematic argument or your controlling idea might be that in certain situations, this is going to come out so terribly, so I apologize, that in certain situations love doesn't win out over evil, for example, or over hate, and so your character not getting what they want will still be speaking to ultimately what your central thematic argument is. So so again, going back to that idea that the resolution of your story doesn't have to be positive, and your character may not get what they want, but you're doing that in order to articulate or explore a particular worldview or a particular controlling idea or central thematic argument. Was there any other detail with that one?
No, I think it was just to kind of elaborate a bit more around that type of story, because obviously tragedy is a very specific kind of story and resolves in a kind of different way to a lot of other stories. So I think they just wanted a bit more detail. Okay. It's a really interesting question here. So this person is a mature documentary filmmaker, and they feel that short films tend to be the realm of new or young filmmakers. So they're just interested in exploring this genre, but they're thinking they might be a bit too long in the tooth. And do we have any thoughts?
I feel like Jude and Quenva, you should jump in on this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, my first response is absolutely, that's rubbish. And if you want to explore, storytelling in the short film format, you should go for it. Obviously, there are kind of short film funds and programs out there that do specifically cater to the kind of younger filmmakers, but there are also lots out there that don't have any kind of age limitation on them, and we're really keen to encourage people who may also have established themselves in other art forms and want to cross over into filmmaking. So we are always keen to have those voices in the mix as well.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult, isn't it, as the filmmaker or as the person spending time with peers or with competitors, for lack of a better word. But I think it's also important to think about the audiences for shorts and the people who do go to film festivals and who program them and who watch all of these things. And ultimately, one thing that is really boring is a sort of unanimous worldview. And so I really wouldn't be put off by that at all. It's important, as in any art form, to get a wide breadth of perspectives and voices.
Definitely.
Yeah, just to echo that as well, absolutely. And I think, I mean, it's very easy to say, yes, don't let that stop you, because I know that it can feel like a barrier. And as you've both highlighted, there are lots of schemes that seem to cater towards a younger age group. So I totally understand where that feeling comes from. But it makes no difference in terms of your ability to tell engaging stories that people want to hear. And I'm hopefully we are starting to see more and more things coming through that cater not just to the sort of up to under 25 age bracket.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's worth pointing out that you do tend to see a lot of coming of age films in the short film kind of format that tend to be focused on kids or teenagers, and I think that is because you have a lot of younger filmmakers who are closer to that. But I'm always really interested to see perhaps coming of age films that relate to people at different stages in their lives as well. I think there are really interesting stories out there that need to be told.
And on a kind of practical level, this industry isn't always a forgiving one or a kind one. It can sometimes feel a bit like a war of attrition on the part of the filmmakers. And so I know that we as funders recognise that people might have had to take career breaks, or they've been working their day jobs, and so plugging to get a certain short made doesn't happen overnight. So we're pretty understanding of the real life barriers that can delay certain processes of certain projects.
Definitely. We've got a question here which I find really interesting. Do you know of any effective short films that have integrated poetry?
Ooh.
Trying to think of an example.
I suppose it depends what kind of integration you're talking about, because there can be poetry films in which it's a poem set to some sort of visual narrative, or where the dialogue itself is quite poetic. I mean, there's an argument for saying that certain rap music videos are kind of doing that as well. I'm trying to think of a good example though.
I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with Random Acts, but they've had a lot of kind of 3-minute kind of film poem type films, or dance films. Yeah. And it does go to show that the short film medium is so versatile. But I think in terms of storytelling, if you were looking at integrating poetry with storytelling, you would still want that to be taking the audience on a journey somewhere.
I feel like I've seen more examples of animation with poetry, but absolutely, if you're wanting it to be longer than a kind of around a max length film, and you're also wanting it to have a narrative, then yeah, as Jude said, making sure there's that change and that journey still taking place.
Okay, so somebody who's interested to know the opinion on comedies and dramas that embody the central controlling argument differently. So structurally, is it to do with character obstacles? So how are comedies and dramas different in doing that?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. Another script editor said to me a while ago, and I think this is quite a helpful way to think about it, that actually structurally comedy and drama is very similar. It's tone that actually makes the difference between a drama and a comedy. And I remember them using the example of the Full Monty, and that actually, if you could have told the same story almost beat for beat as a drama or as a tragedy, but it's the tone that makes it a comedy. So I think structurally, there may not be that much difference. The resolution might be different based on whether it's a comedy or a drama or a tragedy, but there are conventions of genre. So if it's a rom-com, then there are genre conventions and genre beats that you might be looking to hit, but the actual structure itself, I think, would not necessarily change significantly. It's a question of tone. What do you guys think? I'm just involving you in the conversation now.
No, yeah, I absolutely agree.
I think that's bang on. Yeah. I think often, so comedies are really difficult one, I think, especially when it comes to shorts, because with a lot of comedy, I think you need a degree of empathy with the protagonists in order to kind of find their situations and their dialogue endearing or funny, and that's really, really hard to do if you're looking at under 15 minutes. But I think you're kind of on the money, Jess, when you're talking about tone. I think it's a kind of interesting exercise to go through films that you love, if they're tragedies, and imagine how they could be comedies, or vice versa, and trying to kind of pick out exactly what makes them tragic or what makes them comedic, as opposed to just a straight drama. I think it's kind of useful exercise for writers to have a look at.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of want to do it.
No, I'm like, how could we make Hamlet funny?
I like it as a challenge, yeah.
We've got another question here that kind of goes back to that kind of writing process. So the question is, do you think it's fair to say that the process of writing itself can reveal the central thematic argument to the writer?
Yes, I think it can. What I would be careful of is that lots of writers are understandably, because they suck sometimes, but are understandably, not the writers suck, but treatments suck, is what I'm going on to say. That writers can be really reluctant and really hate the process of writing a treatment or writing other kind of development documents. And part of that is that I think it's much more natural for writers to discover certainly things about their character and possibly things about plot and what ultimately they want to say through writing a script and being able to write dialogue and write scenes. But it is also, I think, very helpful to at least have defined some of these things for yourself before you start the writing process. And it does depend on your process, and you might be a writer who needs to get out a kind of vomit draft first in order to uncover those things. But sometimes that can feel quite difficult sort of as you go further along, and particularly with features and things like that. Well, if you're sort of, if you're not necessarily being given the funding to write a draft, and you've only got the funding to write a treatment, you might not want to spend the time that it takes to write an entire draft of a film in order to work out what you need to in order to go back to the treatment to then be allowed to write the official draft. So I think it's really good practice to get into to start defining those things for yourself before you start writing a draft. And that might look different, and whether it's and it will vary from shorts to features as well. And that's, whether that's writing a full treatment, whether that's writing a kind of one-pager, whether that's writing a beat sheet, or it's having a million post-it notes up on your wall, whatever those tools are that sort of resonate with you and your process, that are going to help you define that, as I referred to earlier, that North Star before you start writing. I do think it will help. But yes, you will uncover more as you go through the writing process too. So it's a balance.
Yeah, and I think in terms of my role as a development executive, once I work with funded projects, as Jess says, we will have these kind of very long conversations that aim to kind of tease out exactly what the writer's trying to say. But again, in terms of thinking about I hate to kind of, but the kind of competition, if we're sitting down to assess a funding round, it is so much easier for us, especially if it's from a writer we haven't worked with before, to have a clear idea of what they want to say. They might not have figured out exactly how they're going to articulate it, but for example, we can kind of say, right, this might need development, but we know that this person wants to make a film about the drugs epidemic in the States, or something like that. And what that kind of then morally means. So being able to kind of communicate in essence in a couple of sentences, in a logline, in a synopsis, what you're trying to say is really helpful for us. And then if there are kind of questionable things in it for you or for us, we then work through that if funding is awarded. So I think it's a question of looking at perhaps writers with more experience, and maybe that they do have the kind of privilege of doing that a bit more. But I think if you're looking to kind of really get your foot in the door, being super clear about what you're trying to say will or as clear as you can be, will really help us and other funders and partners get behind your project.
Yeah, I think it's just being aware that that's going to be the first point of interrogation for anybody reading any iteration or version of your story, is that they'll want to dig into what it is you want to say with it. So, if you're engaging with funders, or if you're engaging, for example, with potential producers, those questions are going to come your way as soon as you start to put that story out into the world. So it's something that you are, and it is okay if you're still working through the nuance of it, and it is okay if that shifts slightly during the writing process. I don't think things need to be set in stone, but yeah, it's definitely the key question that anyone engaging with it will be kind of asking.
Yeah, exactly. It is, again, it's sort of once you step out of the arena of just sort of making things for yourself, or like things that are self-funded, where you don't, you're not having to convince, or I'm going to use the term sell to, but I sort of don't mean it in such a cynical way, but you are going to need to communicate your idea to multiple people in order, as the others are saying, for people to get on board and get behind it. So it is necessary. And I also think it is helpful in terms of the writing process too.
Great. I'm aware that we've got quite a lot of questions here, so moving on. We've got one that's quite specific. So what if you have something like climate change as your central protagonist?
Mm-hmm.
How would that work? Sorry, I'm just trying to articulate the question. So if this is what if you have something along the lines of climate change as your central protagonist, and this is what's affecting your central character? So how do you write a log line for something where the central protagonist isn't necessarily a character, but is something much bigger, more, I guess, kind of thematic? Or that's a tricky one.
I'm just wondering if it is as a maybe it is as a protagonist, but could it be as an antagonist? And is it that sort of, you know, like if we thought about a kind of disaster film, for example, where, you know, there's climate change is going to end the world, that can be your antagonist, and that's definitely an external problem or conflict for your central character. So you'd be working on it in the same way. It's just that perhaps what you're exploring is less internal, and more about them, you know. If you're thinking about sort of, I don't know, like an action film or disaster movie.
And then I guess there are other cases where you may want to work heavily with metaphor. So I'm just thinking about perhaps films where specific characters are actually more an embodiment of an idea or of something much bigger. So just randomly thinking about Mother, which, you know, Jennifer Lawrence's character, I don't think they even have names in it, but they are embodying much bigger kind of concepts. But then that still works as a kind of drama between those characters as well. So it's working on those different levels.
Or even like thinking about, this is showing my taste in films now, but thinking about The Day After Tomorrow, where arguably the protagonist is that big sort of global snowstorm that happens. It's still articulated and expressed through the journeys that the characters go through. If they just stayed in their homes and didn't try to go to safety or didn't try to formulate a plan, it would be quite a dull film. So it's looking at that perhaps more abstract character through how the people operate and talk.
Just picking up on that, sort of thinking about what that human story is, you know, where you're might be exploring big concepts, or, you know, big sort of big genre pieces or big sci-fi pieces or something like that, if finding the kind of grounded human story within that is what will allow us, again, as the audience, to sort of connect and be able to explore these sort of bigger themes and ideas in a way that resonates and doesn't become sort of too cerebral. You know, thinking about something like Annihilation as well, that sort of that kind of finding that human story within it is sort of helpful.
Great. Another question here. For a low budget short film, do you think it's better to develop the plot based on what the filmmaker really wants to say, or develop it based on the resources? So, for example, the actor, the location that they can get access to. Is there a risk that in basing it on the resources they've got, you know, does that risk making the argument of the story not as deep, and that it's not exploring the theme as much as it could be? Or do you think that's a valid way of developing a short film idea?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I think it depends what your aim is. So for example, if you're doing one of those sort of like 48-hour film competitions, then you're working within very specific limitations. And that can be a really exciting and interesting challenge in terms of how you go about developing a story that works within those limitations. If you've got more time, I would be inclined to say work through it in the same way that you're thinking about what that argument is, what it is that you want to say as a filmmaker, and sort of maybe you write out your kind of your dream script, but then or you work through it in a way to establish what the emotional beats are of that journey, but then go back to what how you can tell that within your means. I would also be thinking carefully about what is the correct vehicle to tell that story. So for example, it generally doesn't make sense to kind of tell a kind of huge big concept sci-fi story when you've got £500.
Yeah, sorry, Jess, I cut you off there. Sorry.
No, there was just the other thing I was going to say, that you also might want to think about, maybe that's the film that you tell in like 3 short films time when you've got more funding. But God.
Yeah, the one thing that I was going to say, we get a lot of inquiries from emerging talent who approach us as writer-directors or writers and directors, and there's often a lot of confusion about what the role of a producer would fulfill. And I think if you can find a producer who gets your vision and what you're trying to say, these are some of the things that they can work out with you and work out how to convey that message on the budget and what might need to be cut and what can stay. So I would encourage people without producers to kind of think about the films they want to make, maybe look at some short films that are in the same territory and reach out to those producers, try and have a chat, because they will really help you in terms of actually getting your film made in the way that's helpful to you in your progression.
Yeah, thank you.
Producers, very important.
There's somebody here who's been reading about the structure of films and storytelling from Campbell and Vogler with The Hero's Journey, and other theories on kind of structure. How useful do you think focusing on this kind of thing is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hear a lot. I personally, because I kind of geek out about structure, I love reading all those books and kind of knowing the screenwriting theory. And I think it can be very helpful. If it can be really helpful to know those things, but I also think they can sort of sometimes create a sort of rod for your own back, and that you don't want to get, as I sort of said earlier, get too bogged down in the kind of the rules of how you tell a story. I think that they can be helpful to have in your back pocket if something isn't working and that you need a different way of approaching a problem and different ways of fixing something, and it can sort of be a helpful starting point. But I think if you end up very kind of rigidly sticking to, oh, this thing needs to happen on this page and it needs to be followed by this kind of thing, and sort of thinking too much about sort of where your break into act 3 is, and all of those kinds of things, I think it can make the process of writing, for some people, not everyone, more difficult, and can limit your vision sometimes, because you're trying, it's too much writing by numbers. But I do think they can be really, really helpful to just inform your understanding of story, and give you the kind of language and analytical tools, particularly looking at other films. So personally, I think it depends how you use them.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's talking about tools potentially rather than rules, and that isn't, you know, the way that you're going to initially conceive the story, but it is something that can come in to help you work through things that you might be stuck with. Brilliant. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it sometimes seems kind of counterintuitive if you're a creative to kind of talk about discipline, but I think those tools of discipline can be really helpful just to prop up your creative idea on some sort of scaffold, and yeah, getting into those good habits and that good practice, as Jess has said.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. I'm just aware that we're getting up to midday, but if we have time, I might just pick out a few more questions, if that's okay. So we've got one that's quite specific, referring to what you were explaining about the setup. So when you say that the conflict or problem needs to be set up in the first scene or first couple of scenes in a short, do you mean to set up the situation, context and general conflict, or specifically the inciting incident?
So your inciting incident, you can come a little bit later. So in maybe your third or fourth scene, I am sort of arbitrarily picking scene numbers. Yeah, I'm not wanting to be too prescriptive about that. But yes, your setup would be establishing your character's ordinary world, and within that, what their sort of internal or external conflict might be, and then slightly later you'd have the inciting incident happen. And you may not need to give us all of the backstory and all of the context immediately in those first couple of scenes. That might be something that's drawn out as you move through the story. But I think what's really important is to give us the sort of emotional circumstances, and the sort of conflict or problem in the setup that you can then expand on.
Great, thank you. There's a question that I find really interesting here, which is, can there be a situation where it's not the characters who change, but it's the audience's understanding of them as people that changes?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and something I was thinking about yesterday with regards to a script. I think, well, first of all, quite often, or there are examples of comedies in particular where your characters don't change, and that is part of the sort of the comedy of it, that despite everything that is being thrown at them, that actually at the end they end up pretty much where they started off. So yes, I think there are instances where the change isn't necessarily centered around the protagonist. I think those are that's quite difficult to pull off, and the comedy has to be very particular. But if is it our understanding of a character? Personally, I would still want there to be more change that takes place within a character, and I think you don't want to have the thing that's sort of the engine of your story is our perception changing. That I think that ideally wouldn't be the only part of what's propelling the story forward, and that you would still have change within the character. But that could vary depending on what story you're telling.
I I think, you know, thinking about quite short films that have a kind of twist or reveal at the end where what the audience thought was happening is actually something slightly different is a case where you can have those kinds of stories, and they can be very entertaining. I think if you want to, though, tell a story that's genuinely moving, then I think what Jess says, you know, is ideally what you're kind of trying to achieve. So I guess it depends what you want the audience to take away from that.
Yeah.
And I think if you're thinking about, this is perhaps more applicable to television, but if you think about a show that you've watched where a character you found quite unlikable at the beginning, towards the end you've really warmed to them, that's very rarely just off your own back. That is through their actions or through perhaps growth on their part. So yeah, as Jess said, I'd caution against relying too heavily on your audience, because people have short attention spans and they can be quite lazy. Like, you do often need to feed them these kind of hints and clues to get them there.
Yeah, and I think you also want to be careful, because I'm thinking of a couple of specific short films where you're not just relying on a device or like trickery. So where you've kind of sat through something and then it's kind of like, oh, everything you thought about this is not true. That, as Jude said, that can be sort of entertaining, but I think for it to really have impact, you want to be able to marry that with something deeper, and to see change take place in your character as well.
Okay, we've got another question here, if that's okay, that is from somebody who has a story that has no dialogue at all, and they're just asking whether this is an issue.
No. I don't think so.
That's an easy one.
Yeah. No, as long as you've got all of the other elements needed for narrative, no, I don't think you don't need dialogue at all.
I think a good example of that is probably animations, right? You can have plenty of non-verbal animations that still land emotionally with the audience that have.
And the thing about a dialogue-free film doesn't need translating for international audiences, so it's something that crosses frontiers in a really kind of great way if you're kind of aiming to get it out internationally. Okay, do we have a little bit more time? Sorry, I'm just aware that we're going past 12.
Okay, I can probably do another 5 minutes.
Okay, let's go for it. So we've got a question which is, does the ratio of dialogue to visuals change depending on the length of the film? So would the 20-80 split that you talked about still apply to a very short feature, for example?
Yes. So that, or rather, no, the percentage wouldn't change necessarily. The only instance where I think it could change in film is with comedy. So you do have a license to use more dialogue in a comedy, because that's sort of part of the language or aesthetic of comedy. But ideally, and again, don't get too bogged down with the percentages, but it's helpful. Again, it's sort of best practice to be thinking about the fact that this is cinema and needs to be cinematic, and so even within a short film, always trying to look for the other ways that you can dramatize or communicate what you want to communicate without using dialogue.
Great, thank you. So somebody's writing a film where there are 3 central characters. Do you think there should always be a focus on one of them, or is it harder to watch a film that divides attention between the 3 of them?
So the more characters the more sort of main characters you have, the more our emotional engagement will be diffused. So what you want to think about is what are you doing that sort of makes up for the maybe slightly less emotional engagement that we would have if we have a single protagonist and a single POV. That means we can embed in that more, and therefore our emotional engagement is greater. But you might have an ensemble film, or sort of a three-hander. I'm thinking something like The Hours. What you gain there is a particular exploration of theme or idea. So it depends. It sort of depends what you're trying to say, what you're trying to explore, what your goal is. I think so. It doesn't mean that you have to have one protagonist or centralize one story. It just means that you'd have to think about really carefully what you're trying to do with the film, basically.
Great, thank you. And I'll make this the last question. I think it's a good one to kind of close this session with. What advice can you give for an emerging filmmaker on navigating their own voice within the production and kind of directing process?
Oh, that is a good one.
Yeah, and you guys definitely should jump in on this as well.
Yeah, I think it's just from working a lot with emerging talent, it is a very delicate thing. I think it's quite a common thing that writer directors will work with the producer for the first time, and then they won't follow up that relationship for their second film. And so I think one thing that's really important when you're navigating that relationship from the off is just to set parameters and to very clearly say, this is the kind of film I want to make. I understand that there'll be restrictions and I'm willing to do X, Y, and Z, but this is the one thing I will not let go of. And if the producer doesn't like what you're selling, then it's better to kind of cut that off at the beginning and find someone who's more in your kind of wheelhouse, than kind of find yourself in production and you being at loggerheads. I think just being really clear and honest from the off and holding your ground without being perhaps too stubborn is a really important thing. And I think, again, a really good discipline to get into, kind of putting on a bit more of your strategist industry hat on for those first few meetings, as opposed to welding too completely to your creative idea, because ultimately a good producer is there to help you. They don't want to ruin your film. And yeah, entering that relationship with faith and transparency, I think, is a good idea.
I totally agree. You know, finding the right collaborators and being able to communicate honestly and clearly with them is so important. Also, you know, if in terms of, you know, if you're getting funding and you're getting kind of feedback notes, always just try and understand. You may not agree with them all, and that's absolutely fine, and you may not kind of feel that they've exactly kind of gotten what you want to say. If they haven't, communicate that to them and keep that dialogue going, and just understand maybe where the notes are coming from rather than taking them to the letter. You know, if somebody's given you a set of notes that you don't feel relevant, well, what is it that they are trying to dig at, and how might they have misunderstood what you're trying to say? So how can you kind of be stronger in how you're saying that, how you're communicating? Sorry, does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
I think because it is tricky. I think, especially if you're a newer filmmaker and you're working with kind of a funder or a commissioner for the first time, how to take on board those notes and then still make sure that the film is really your vision and the story that you want to tell is so important.
Yeah, because ultimately this is, I know I've kind of said it before, but it is a difficult industry. Not to put anyone off, we're here to be supportive and encouraging. But nobody is out there to get you. Anybody who is on board with the project is there to help you. So as Jude says, if there is a kind of miscommunication or something's running up to a breakdown of trust, just sit down and try and work it through, because yeah, it's all about communication, both in your story and within your team.
Yeah, completely echo all of that. That it is really important to remember that you're all on the same team, and that you're all working towards the common goal of making the best version of this film possible. It is really, really important, as you both said, to define what's important to you from the beginning, and sort of, you know, what the things are that you maybe don't want to compromise on, or, you know, or where you feel like there is too big a compromise, and you really feel like your vision for the film is being compromised to you know, to too great an extent. But I think particularly within, when you're getting notes and feedback, where that feels really painful and difficult, thinking about, does this feel painful and difficult because the notes process can sometimes be painful and difficult, and it can make you feel really vulnerable, and it can bring up all sorts of things, you know, all like self-doubt, and imposter syndrome, and, you know, there are all sorts of things that can sort of come up emotionally and psychologically within the notes process, that don't necessarily mean therefore that the notes are wrong, or that you shouldn't pay attention to the notes. So if you're kind of repeatedly finding that you're just hating getting notes, it might be that, you know, you want to think about this differently, and sort of, and find different ways of managing the notes process. And
I think there's a way of communicating that with the person who's giving the notes. For example, before I give notes to any of the projects I'm working with, I say my normal process is to send written notes, give you a kind of week to digest, then chat them over on the phone. If you find that process of getting written feedback quite difficult, then just say so, and say I'd rather have a chat about it and kind of work through it verbally over the phone. Nobody's going to take offence to that or question that. It's about, as Jess said, figuring out your relationship to the development process and how you can make it work for you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jess, for all of your insights.
Jess.
Brilliant. And thank you to everyone attending for all of the really great questions as well. I'll just finish up by kind of flagging where you can find out further information about BFI Network. So if you go to the Ffilm Cymru website, there is a section for BFI Network that lists all of our funds, including for kind of short film production and feature development, and also career development. We also run a fund which is for people who want to set up their own networking or peer or training groups. So all of the information is on the website, and all of our contact information is there as well. I'll also just flag that our folio programme, which Ffilm Cymru runs with BBC Arts and Arts Council Wales, is currently open for applications. So if you are if you are new to filmmaking and you don't yet have a professional directing credit in film or TV, you might be crossing over from another discipline, or you might be totally new to the medium of film. Take a look. Again, the information is on our website under folio. We're open for applications until the 7th of August, I believe, on folio, and our colleagues are currently running talent surgeries for anybody who's interested in applying. So do take a look and book in for a session if you would like to chat to the team. Great, I think that's it from us, but thank you very much again to Jess. And we have been recording this session, so if all goes well, we'll be able to share it as well via email.
One thing I'd just like to add, I've noticed that there's plenty of really interesting questions that we've not been able to get to, and we're here to work for Welsh or Wales-based writers, directors, producers. So if you have time, if you could kind of send us a quick message about what you found helpful, or whether sessions like this in the future would be helpful, or whether just a general Q&A session would be helpful, that would be really good for us to know. So yeah,
so we'll We'll be
Welcome.
sending around a feedback form as well to everybody who has signed up. So if you're able to share your thoughts, it will just be maybe 5 or 6 questions, so quite short. So we'd really appreciate you sharing your feedback on today's session as well as telling us what kinds of activities you'd like to see us set up in the future. Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Jess.
Bye.
Bye.